Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films and Cinema Studios. Welcome to part 2 of the dry brushing tutorial. Today we're making a nebula. So if you haven't already seen part 1 of this video, go ahead and check that out over here. Basically, I introduced the technique and we make a waterfall with the dry brush technique. If you haven't already seen that video, the stuff in this video probably won't make as much sense, so go check that out first. So if you've already seen it or have just come back from watching it, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so unlike part 1 of this tutorial, which came out last week, I'm not going to be using a piece of black gessoed cardboard, but instead a piece of actually black gessoed canvas. Now this is a simple 12 by 12 inch canvas that I had just kind of lying around, and it sat for a while, and I'm like, you know what, I think I'll need something sort of space themed for this. And when I started thinking about the idea of a sort of dry brush nebula, I'm like, you know what, this would make a good tutorial. So what I've already done here with this is, aside from gessoing the canvas black, is I also took a bit of my regular black paint mixed with some Prussian blue, just to kind of give it a nice sort of dark sky that isn't stark black. I wanted it to have a little bit of underlying color to it, which you probably won't see right away, but the more we work down the road, the more some of that underlying color is going to start to show through. So for this type of piece, you can choose really whatever colors you want for a nebula. I decided to go with cool colors, or at least sort of cool, warmish colors. So I've chosen red and blue as my main color scheme. I also have my regular quinacridone magenta, which is a good mixing color between the two of them. If you add the red to it, it'll kind of balance the red out, make it a little more rich. If you add the blue, we get a nice purple. I've also have titanium and zinc white from part 1 of this tutorial. I just kind of put that little palette right on top of the other one. If you noticed already and you watched part 1, I don't have my palettes on a separate screen in the corner, as I do with some of my tutorials. I just figured with this smaller size, it wasn't really necessary. So that's enough of me talking. Let's go ahead and get started on this. I'm going to start by mixing up a bit of a purple, or at least a dark bluish purple color, with acrylic painting and a lot of mediums in general. A lot of times you want to work from light to dark, but when working on a black canvas, it's kind of reversed. A lot of times we're going to be working from dark to light. So for this, particularly acrylics, because acrylics dry in the manner and speed that they do, you actually can work from dark to light or light to dark, and it works interchangeably and either way, depending on the technique you're going to use and what you're kind of the end result that you're going for. So for this, my brush is a little bit moist. It's not terrible. I did clean it recently in the water, but I've used my rag, which again, if you need a rag, grab one. A lot of times I'm using my pants, but for drawing the brush between dry brushing, a lot of times I'm needing a little more absorbency than what my jeans can offer. So you want to grab a little bit of paint, and just like we did in part 1, we're just kind of wiping that off of the brush, getting barely any paint on the brush to create that dry brush effect. So I'm just going to kind of come up and in, just kind of pull it around a little bit. Again, not going overboard, but we're just using the smallest amount of paint we can to create a texture effect on the canvas. And for this, I really like doing little crisscross strokes, particularly because I'm doing a sky section. So I want to make it sure that it seems uniform, but still a little bit more haphazard. Now the idea in my head for this is to kind of have a bit of a swirl, like a little bit of an S-curve. So as I'm working on this, I am thinking about that as I go. I'm going to go ahead and throw this section into time-lapse, and I will be back to talk when I finish this first layer. Okay, now that I've got that layer taken care of, I wanted to bring up one more thing before we continue on, is that the best way to use the dry brushing technique is with an older brush. Now this brush is sort of, it's not new, it's not old, it's sort of a mid-range brush. But one thing that dry brushing can do is really beat the crap out of your brushes, because you're often being a little harder with them than you would be doing normally. So if you don't want your brush to kind of die, you might want to use an older one if you have it available. If not, buy a brush specifically for dry brushing. So I've got a nice base color here, and you probably can't see it real well. I think to the camera it's pretty much just still black. What you're not seeing, though, is what you are seeing. Essentially what that means is that when you use a color like the blue on something that would normally be a white surface, you would get that blue color because the white is showing through. Because we're working on a black canvas, you're not getting that color to show through, at least as much as you would think would happen on a white canvas or just a lighter toned one. So it's important to note that when you're working on a black canvas, the color that you're going to see is going to be the color both of the paint as well as the color underneath, sort of mixing together. Which again is the same as white canvas, but if that's what you're used to, then you don't really notice it. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush a little. Hesitated there for a minute. I'm like, do I? Yeah, I should. I really should. Now the Galaxy is going to lean a little bit redder. At least that's kind of the way I envisioned it. So I'm going to mix up a little more of a pure purple now. That one was more blue. Put a little of my red in here as well. And this should be the first layer that you guys really start to see. Now, the more layers you choose to use for any kind of dry brushing technique, specifically if you're making a nebula like we are today, the more complex and interesting that thing is going to be. For me, I don't use at least not a ton of layers in my work, and that's just essentially part of my signature style, that I don't overwork the piece, so it does retain some level of simplicity. So again, we're going to take the color into the brush and wipe a good bit of it off, getting just a nice dry brush effect. And here we come in again, little crisscross strokes. Particularly for the nebula, as we work, everything's going to start wide and get kind of thinner and thinner and thinner, because we want that one section in the center to seem like that star belt, that one section that's going to be the most concentrated. Is starting to show through a little bit here. Hopefully that's visible to you guys. Actually, I may... Okay, so I just decided to put a couple of cans of my painting medium up to elevate the canvas to you so you guys can see the color a little bit better here. Again, I do apologize about the earlier glare. But sometimes I just get a little bit excited about what I'm working on. And the motion of your brush, the direction you're kind of pulling it, of course, will change the direction of your nebula cloud, so you want to think about that as you're working. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to work on getting a little bit lighter now. I'm actually going to add some yellow into my palette. It's going to work on brightening the red a bit. I know I said I was sticking to cooler colors, but just based on the way this is progressing, I think it's going to kind of make a bit of a difference to have to lighten my red with yellow rather than with white. So I'm going to grab even more red. Now I could go a little bit lighter right now, but I think I do want to work a few more complex layers into this. So I'll use, again, not wetting the brush in between layers, we're just grabbing that same dirty brush. I do really like this cardboard for drying out the brush with. in and just... See, now the dry brushing is going to seem a lot more amplified since we're getting a little bit lighter. Another great way to use this technique is to use it when doing clouds, particularly like blue sky, sunny clouds, or really any kind of sky clouds, because you can really work up the individual layers. If you watch any of Tim Gonier's work here on YouTube, you'll see him actually use dry brushing for a lot of his cloud work. That was a little too much paint. Got to try and pull some of that out and at least work it into the piece a bit more. When you dry brush on canvas versus dry brushing on paper, the dry brushing is going to pick up the texture of the canvas. And that's particularly when working with canvas, that's one of the advantages it has. You can use the dry brush technique for a little more interesting and intricate techniques and just interesting visual looks to the piece. Really kind of amplifying the dry brushing. Alright, next color layer, we're going to add a little bit of the rest of our red and a little yellow. And just brighten it up. And I'll add a little bit of our titanium white as well. So again, same brush, not rinsing it. Dry it off. Pull up paint, wipe it off, and bring in your dry brush. And I'm being more sparing with it the more layers I add on, keeping again my color into the center a bit more. Little crisscrossy strokes. Alright, so from here I'm going to get a hell of a lot brighter. I'm actually going to get more yellow, make sort of an orange color, and then mix in a little bit of white for the final layer. Before we do that, we probably want to let this layer dry so we can work on a drier canvas surface rather than a wet one and having our colors mixed in a little bit too much. Because dry brushing is a lot about layering, not so much about blending your colors. So while I'm waiting for this to dry, at least dry a little bit more before I decide to start adding stuff in, I want to start adding a few stars in as well. Now, I already have a tutorial on creating stars for your paintings, and it basically involves flicking paint onto the surface. That works really well. So does using a stiff brush and kind of spraying with it, sort of in a similar way you might do with an old toothbrush. I kind of lean towards the splattery stars. I just think they're a little bit more expressive. So for this, I actually have to take the canvas back down. So again, I apologize about this glare. But for this technique to work, I need to make sure the stars don't drip. So I'm going to grab a little water, mix it in with my white. Also, you notice I rearranged some things a little bit here. This is my quinacridone magenta mixed with some cad yellow medium, and then some of that color back into that red we just had to kind of give this sort of brick-like color to it. So we're going to get a little water, and I got my big bucket of water off to the side here now that I'm dipping my hand in. Just want to get a couple of stars in here. Something to kind of lighten up the mood a bit. And once we add the remaining nebula to this, we're going to basically be covering some of these stars up and then adding some new ones in over top, just for a really interesting effect. Particularly the idea that some of the stars are behind the gas and some of them are in front of it. So don't be too liberal with your stars. Some of the darker sections I'd actually like to have more clusters. The closer we get to the gas, we'd see a little bit less of them. And all you have to do is just look up, pictures on NASA's website of different nebulas, and you can kind of have a nice example to go from here. You're not totally making it up. At least that's what I did before this tutorial. I looked up some nebulas and I'm like, yeah, I can manage that. Alright, let me tilt this back up. There you are. And as you can see, really kind of brings some interesting life into the piece. So I'm going to give these stars about 5 minutes here. Let the ones, it's a light amount of paint, so it shouldn't take too long to dry. So give it about 5-10 minutes, and we should be good to go for our next layer. Okay, so the majority of our star section is now dry. There are a couple of the larger ones which are wetter, but we shouldn't be worrying about touching those, at least at this time. So again, load that up on your brush, wipe it away, and you've got sort of the perfect load for a bit of dry brushing. You're just kind of working a little more color on top of those sections. I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm not going to do everything. So I do want to give the impression that these upper sections, that's way too much paint, are really kind of floating there on top rather than, oh, that one was still wet. We could actually probably add a little more paint on top of that then. So we have the underlying nebula, and then the overlying stuff, which we can actually even cross into some of the stuff we didn't sort of prep with the darker colors. And that stuff specifically is on top of the other stars and sections we did, just kind of giving that extra layer of depth. This was way too much paint in here. Actually, just now, I think, kind of getting to the level of where I needed it to be. Wipe that. I have a little too much moisture in my brush. I rinsed it in between takes here. So that's one of the reasons why my paint is spreading a little too far. Again, you want really a minimal amount of spreading that paint, just little bits. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and add in our top or upper layer, or uppermost layer. Sounds a bit strange there. So we're adding that orange. Again, wipe as much of that paint off as you can, really just adding little bits at a time. And then just kind of tap in little circular crisscross motions and over top. Add a little bit more in here actually. Now you do want to be sparingly, particularly if you're using orange over blue, because any orange is going to hit the transparent blue and look a little bit too muddy. Kind of want to lean toward a little more concentrated color in the center. Really let that be my focal point, so I can actually grab a little extra of the orange there. And if this is your first time doing a nebula, it probably isn't going to be perfect. You might need to do it a couple times on some practice paper before you're ready to go on canvas. If you want to use cardboard, actually, that would be a really good sort of practice medium for this. Right about like that. Now I'm going to go ahead and wait for this to dry, add a few more stars to this, and when I finish that, I'll be back to wrap this video up. So whether you're using a dry brush technique to make a simple waterfall, or something a little more complex like a nebula, it's really a great technique to know, to learn, and to use repeatedly in a variety of your own painting projects. For this particular painting, I really like the way this is turning out so far. Gonna have a lot of fun kind of creating a interesting and unique alien landscape for the rest of this piece. But that is a tutorial for another day and for another time. So be sure to subscribe for more art videos like this one. And this has been from DMC Films and Cinderblock Studios. See you guys next time.